Hey guys, welcome back to another edition of Refactoring UI. Today we're going to be taking a look at a submission from Christopher Harris. It's a side project he's been working on called Bad About, and it allows you to quickly share and discover the drawbacks about something to help you make a more informed decision, be it a product, service, or another general topic. It's pretty cool. And right now they're looking for early contributors to help kickstart the community. So check it out, create an account, and make a post if you think you have something worth sharing. And today we're going to be looking at the topic page that lists all of the posts, this one being for the Apple iPhone X. Now, the general layout is off to a decent start, but we're going to see if there's a few things we can do to clean it up without affecting the functionality of the page too much. Now, here's a sketch mockup I made, so let's start with the post section. Everything's looking a little bit crammed in here, so we're going to do a few things to give everything room to breathe. And just to avoid getting distracted by the rest of the page, we're going to pull one of these posts out of the UI to make some tweaks and then bring it back in when we're done. So the first thing we're going to do is increase the width of the panel. It's pretty tight, especially for all the information that's being squeezed in here. And it's particularly noticeable on the title. Some of these titles are pretty long, so we definitely want to increase the reading width of them. That gives us much more room to work with. And we're going to divide this content into thirds. The first 2/3 are going to be for the title of the post, and then 1/3 of the space will be used for the voting. Let's also decrease the size of the font from 20 pixels to 18 pixels so we have a little more room to work with. And we're just going to increase the line height a bit for more comfortable reading. We're also going to group the meta and action icons together. Right now they're looking a little bit messy because they're sort of all over the place. So we're going to put the username and date together, separating them with a dot for distinction. And we're also going to move the icons just to the right of those as well as make them a bit lighter. When you have solid fill icons like this, they tend to have a heavier weight than the text they're beside. So I like to make them a bit lighter than the text so they feel more balanced. And finally, we're going to reduce the size of the icons so visually they look like they're closer to the size of the text. And now that we've moved all of this information underneath the post title, we've freed up some space on the left here. So that gives us a little more room to work with. Now the show more button, it's looking a bit clunky, and I just want to make a side note. When I was browsing some of the posts, I couldn't help but notice that most of the descriptions are the same as the title of the post. So there's a pretty good argument to make this description optional, but I don't want to focus on that right now. I just want to find a way to de-emphasize this a bit. And another site that uses this expand to show more button is YouTube, and they just do it with a text link, which couldn't be clear, and it just looks a lot more subtle. So we're going to apply this to the design, and we're just going to do it in line with the post title. That way, if the title is compelling enough to read on, it feels natural to just click it and continue reading. Now that's looking much more de-emphasized, and this whole section is looking much more cleaner. So let's now move over to the voting options on the right. Okay, so the first thing that stands out is those upvote and downvote arrows. Right now they're taking up a lot of horizontal space, and I think they'll be a bit easier to use and just look more natural if they're stacked on top of each other. We also want to increase the size of the label and the value because we want the value to be much more scannable and taken in at a glance. And in addition to increasing the size of the value, we're also going to increase the contrast because it's pretty light right now. Now, even though we increased the size of the labels, we still kept them pretty small because they're repeated in every section. But we still want them to have a little bit of emphasis. So an easy way to achieve that is by making them uppercase. Now, because uppercase letters don't have varied shapes like lowercase letters do, words can be a bit hard to read and scan. So what I like to do is apply a bit of letter spacing when using uppercase just to give the letters more room to breathe. Now, because the post title is left aligned, I want to make the voting feel left aligned as well. Plus, when it's centered like it currently is, it sort of feels like it's just floating there, and left aligning it sort of anchors it to that spot. And I'm just going to bring these down so the labels are sitting on the same baseline as the first line of the post title. And another thing that's a bit repetitive is this help icon. It's shown on every single post along the right-hand side, and it contains the same information. And I really think this information could be put into the help icon that's showcased on the left sidebar. So we're going to go ahead and remove that just to free up some additional space. And finally, we're going to lighten the arrow icons for the same reason we did with the share and report icons. And I'm also going to increase the vertical space of the panel just to give it more room to breathe. Okay, so I think that's looking much better now and overall much cleaner. So what we're going to do now is apply this treatment to the rest of the design just to see how much of an impact these little changes made to the overall experience. Okay, so I think this is looking much cleaner and organized. And even though we added a lot of vertical spacing to the panels to give them room to breathe, we've actually managed to reduce the overall height of the content because we increased the reading width of the post, preventing it from excessive wrapping. And now that we're using liberal vertical spacing on the posts, we can probably do without this space between each panel, allowing us to tighten it up a bit more. Now this header, it's looking a bit heavy and taking focus away from the posts. So we're going to de-emphasize it a bit by giving it the same background color as the posts and invert the text color. We're also going to increase the spacing to give it room to breathe and then lighten the title font a bit. And this help icon is feeling a little detached, so we're just going to move it to the right of the title. We're also going to give the load more button the same treatment, so this whole section feels like one group. And because we're using rounded corners on all of the buttons, for consistency, we're going to apply the same corner radius on this panel. Now, we really want this to stand out because it's probably the most important section on the page, but right now it's gray on a white background, so it feels like it's standing back a bit. So we're going to flip this so the page background is gray and the posts are white. We're also going to drop this border and replace it with a box shadow just to make it look a little bit cleaner. Now, in the previous edition of Refactoring UI featuring WP Pusher, I talked about my technique for drop shadows and how I layer multiple shadows to make them look more natural. So we're going to give this a similar treatment. Okay, so I think that's looking much cleaner now. So let's move on. Now, when I first landed on this page, I didn't realize there were all these additional categories below the facts until I scrolled. So we want to make that a bit more obvious. And I think a way we can do that is by introducing a vertical navigation on the left side, something that would always remain there when you scroll and would just act as anchor links to each section. But before we do that, I want to clean up some of the information that's already there. Right now, everything's looking a bit messy. The title is right aligned, everything else is centered, there's a lot of inconsistent spacing. And since we want to add the vertical navigation here, I think it would make sense if we move some of the information that's currently there to the top of the page. So we're going to put the title on the top left and put the share icon beside it. And then we're going to move the call to action to the top right just to balance things out a bit. Now, orange is a really difficult color to work with. It's hard to make it look good and accessible with white text because, as you can see right now, it fails. So you could darken it, but you're going to end up with something that looks closer to brown. So if you're working with a color like this, what I like to do is find a lighter alternative and make the text dark instead of white. So what I'm using here is a little bit closer to yellow, but it still manages to work nicely with the orange used in the logo. And instead of making the text gray, we're going to saturate it with the warmer color just to make it feel like it's sort of glued to the button. We're also going to simplify the text a bit, and because we're using all caps, I'm going to once again increase the letter spacing. Now, because I made that button a lighter orange, you might be thinking I should give this sign-in button the same treatment. But instead, I'm actually going to de-emphasize it even more and make it look more like a secondary button. And the reason for this is I like to have just one primary action on a page. Having multiple can get a bit confusing, but using just one can help users understand what the purpose of the page is. And that's exactly what the new post button is doing for us. So we're just going to give this a 1 pixel border and invert the text color. Now this information is looking much more organized and it clears up the left side where we want to introduce our navigation. So I'm going to create a link for each section of this topic and left align it. Now let's just style this help information by left aligning the icon to bring more attention to it. And we'll emphasize the text by italicizing it. Now, as you can see, I'm aligning everything nicely to a grid. And for centered layouts like this, I almost always work with a 12 column grid as it's pretty flexible and it makes it really easy to divide your content into multiples of 4, 3, and 2. So as you can see, the left side navigation is going to take up a quarter of the page and the main content area is going to take up 3/4 of the page. And as I mentioned earlier, the content of these panels is going to be divided into thirds. So the post title is going to take up 2/3 and the voting is going to take up the remaining third. Okay, so that's looking more organized now. So let's style the navigation. Now, because some of the posts might be hidden within the show more expand button at the bottom, I thought it would be nice to include the amount of posts within each section in the navigation, just to provide a little bit of clarity. I also want to highlight the current section we're on, so we're going to de-emphasize the other sections by making them a bit lighter, and I'm also going to give the active state a light background color. I'm also going to add a hint of orange to the left of this active state. I really like adding hints of color like this, as it's a nice and easy way to bring attention to something. Okay, so let's just tighten things up a bit, and I'm going to make this share icon a bit lighter because I forgot to earlier, and then we'll move on to the header. Okay, so first let's make the header white like we did with the post section, and then give it the same shadow treatment. We're also going to make it a bit taller so we can make these buttons a bit bigger and just give them more room to breathe. Now in my last video, which featured WP Pusher, I talked about how I like to make my inputs gray when on a white background, as it eliminates the need for borders and it just looks a bit cleaner. So we're going to apply that here. Now the language on this button is conflicting a bit with the post button on this page, which can be a little bit confusing. So we're going to make this a little more direct and call it what it is. And even though this button is a different color than the primary action, it still does compete with it a bit. So we're going to tone it down a bit. Now, if we were on the browse page that listed all the topics, I would consider making it the primary action there. But in this case, we really want that new post button to stand out as much as possible. And I'm not really concerned about it getting lost because it's on the top bar, sort of grouped with the search intended for discovering topics. So they're very much associated with each other. And just to give it a little more visual interest and make it look more actionable, we're going to add an icon to the left of it. So that's looking much better. And again, we're just going to tighten things up a bit and make this menu icon a bit lighter like we did with every other icon on the page. Now, as I was working on this page, I noticed there are a lot of different grays being used. I've seen some solid grays as well as a few that were saturated with a bit of blue. And I see this sort of thing happening quite a bit, and it just looks messy in the design as well as in the code. And for this design, we could probably get away with using as little as 3 grays, one dark one for primary text used on things like titles, posts, and values, and then a lighter one for secondary text, and then maybe a third one for the icons. And we're going to be using true grays instead of the cool grays that are saturated with a bit of the blue that are seen in parts of the design, mainly because the primary color is orange, which is a bit warmer of a color, and the cool grays don't work as well with that. Let's also change the typeface. Right now, the design is using Roboto, which is a great typeface, but maybe we can find something a little more premium. And just to experiment, let's use 2 different typefaces. So I noticed that the logo type is using Proxima Nova. I personally love Proxima Nova. It's clean, versatile, and it just looks great on most screens. So maybe we can bring that into the rest of the design. Now, one site I like to check out is fontsinuse.com. And it's just as the title says, it's a gallery of fonts in use. And it's great for finding inspiration and great font pairings. So since I already decided I want to use Proxima Nova, I'm going to search for it and see if I can find a great pairing for it. And immediately I'm presented with a ton of great results. And just scrolling through the first page, I saw this example called Subtle with a V that uses Proxima Nova for the body text and Freight Sans for the headings. And this is a combination I probably wouldn't have considered on my own, but seeing it here helped me realize how well the two work together. So we're going to try this combination on the design and just use Freight Sans for the page title. Now, I really like the bold version of this font. It sort of looks fun but professional at the same time, and we really want this title to stand out. Okay, so I think that's looking much better. I think it really shows how much impact a high quality typeface can make on the overall design. And that pretty much wraps everything up. I'm just going to make these blue saturated icons gray because I missed them earlier. And let's just compare the new design with the original. If you want to check out this design in Sketch, I've included a link to download the files in the description. You can also check out the site Bad About at bad-about.com. And if you enjoyed this video and want to receive updates when more content like this is published, be sure to sign up at refactoringui.com.